Good morning. Hello, everybody. I hope everyone's having a great Wednesday. I love this weather outside. It's been stunning in our beautiful California. We're going to continue today, chapter 26. We are in the middle of the thick of things. I've really been enjoying the discussion we had last week, and it's going to get even better this week. We are, if you're looking in your book, in your textbook, it's going to be on page 298. Someone could correct me if they have another page on there. But the last thing I have is 298. I'll be pulling it up on my Kindle in a moment. And let's just give a moment of review. We're in the middle of an awesome section. I'm just going to start with reading a Hasidic thought that we had at the bottom of 297 that was really just summarizing such an integral point, I think, to this chapter. So I'll first read it, we'll discuss it, and we'll carry on with a really essential conversation about the power of joy and how we implement that in our life and how we really are able to cope with things that are happening in our life that are challenges, that are struggles, how to see the good in things, and how to be joyful. So it's all a very integral discussion to Judaism, to life in general. I'm just going to read one little Hasidic thought, and it goes like this. Sadness is acceptable, indeed desirable, if it is A, experienced only occasionally, during specially scheduled times of introspection, and not when I'm going about my day-to-day life, and B, if it's justified sadness over my transgressions. If both these conditions are met, even though the sadness itself is something negative, it will have a positive result. So that was a beautiful discussion where we started off the chapter of Tanya by saying that the attitude, the joy that we have in our service is an essential aspect to it. Because without it, if we're feeling sluggish, we're feeling down, we can't serve Hashem properly. And even though sometimes we do see this sadness, and we see from Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech, that in every sadness there will be profit, that tells us that the sadness itself is not virtual, it's not virtuous, it's not something good for us, but it could lead to a profit. Meaning if we already had that sadness, there's a way to make a gain out of it. And that is, if we utilize that sadness to actually incorporate it to our joy, it will if it has a positive result. Meaning if I'm sad over the transgressions, that will propel me to be more scrupulous and more careful in my observance. So if I have that as my introspection, and it's dedicated times of my week, when I allow myself half an hour sections of the day, of the week, where I'm putting myself in a place of reflection and introspection, so it's really in a set time that you designate for it, then it's allowed because of the gain that comes as a result. So that was a beautiful point. We learned from the Arizal, from Rabbi Isaac Luria, he was known as the Ari, which means the lion of blessed memory, that after we, in the olden days, when they would read the Tikkun Chatzot, which means the correction of midnight, that after midnight, in the olden days, people would get up from their sleep and read some lamentations, mourning the destruction of the temple, mourning the exile and the spiritual darkness that we're in. But incorporated in that, Rabbi Isaac Luria incorporated the verses from King David, from Psalms 51, to learn and to read about the importance of the broken heart leading to the joy. And in Hebrew, the words were Tashmi'eni Sason V'Simcha, which means that we should hear tidings of joy and gladness. Restore me the joy of your salvation, and to have a generous spirit. That was all from King David, where the broken heart, he was saying after his mistake he made, and it led him to teshuvah, but it brought him to a place of joy. That was his whole prayer, to be brought to a place of joy. So we incorporate that in our Tikkun Chatzot to make sure that it's being done for the sake of that gain and that profit that comes as a result.
Rabbi, I have a question.
Sure. I'm glad I could hear you today, Barbara. Awesome.
We got a new camera, which and the speaker works.
Perfect.
There is no mention of death in that sadness. When you're in mourning, is that a separate thing? Or somebody, God forbid, is deathly sick. Is that a separate thing from what you're talking about?
So for sure, when someone is mourning the passing of a loved one, the time calls for you to be sad, right? There's actually a command in the Torah set for Onen, which is the time actually before even the funeral, the time of confusion, the time of turmoil, the time of raw sadness that can't be comforted yet. And then, of course, the time of the Shiva following the funeral, it's a set time for sadness. And it's hard to say that from that sadness should be joy. So I'm just thinking out loud. Definitely that is a time dedicated for sadness. But I would venture to say that's not what we're referring to. Because that's a sadness that I don't think any joy is supposed to lead from there. But actually, we're going to be quoting. This is one of the main things I started in the introduction to Tanya, into this chapter 2 weeks ago. Some of you perhaps remember at a Jewish funeral, the mourners, what they say, Barbara, is Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. They actually say a blessing with God's name that says, blessed is the true judge. And it's going to be a discussion we're going to be having at length in this week's chapter. And actually today we're going to be touching on it, which is we bless God for the bad just as we do for the good. Just like we say Baruch Hashem on the good, we also have to say Baruch Hashem on the bad. And we say that by every funeral. Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, blessed is the true judge. So, having said that, I may reconsider that even in the time of sadness, there's supposed to be something that comes as a result, perhaps even by the time of Shiva. The inspiration that it leads to, the living with more zest and alacrity, and living every moment without allowing it to be wasted, that comes as a result of the sadness that follows death for the mourners. It may be what we're talking about, the result of it. I don't know. It's a good question, and you may know the answer better than me after we get to it. And it's actually going to be coming up in section 3. But I like the question, and especially about illness, severe illness especially. Is that related or not? Ooh, good one. Let's find out.
Yeah, hi, good morning, everybody. I'm sorry I'm late. I missed your question, Barbara. I came in at the end of your explanation, Rabbi, and I've been thinking about something very similar all week.
Yeah.
And when I was in college, I read The Pursuit of Loneliness by Philip Slater, and a phrase and a thought of his has stuck in my mind since I read it. And that is, and I've been struggling to understand it, and that is hope.
Sadness over religious matters is only appropriate at specially scheduled sessions of introspection, such as before going to sleep. The sadness of these sessions helps to restore joy by breaking the negative energy field which surrounded you as a result of your sins. So I think we read that last week, but now where we're up to, we're learning that the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, instituted to read verses of joy from King David in the time of our sadness that we read mourning the destruction of the temple, which we do after midnight. It's called Tikkun Chatzos. We learned from there a really cool verse from Solomon that says in Ecclesiastes, he says, precisely like the advantage of light over darkness. We'll just start from there. So join me on 298, the last paragraph. I'm going to pull up the Kindle. Oops, Maddie is waiting. I'm going to pull up the Kindle that may or may not start talking on. All right, here we go. You can follow along on the screen. Or of course, oops, in your book, 298 in the book, bottom paragraph, or in the middle of the Kindle. All right, here we go. The Tanya notes that Psalm 51 was appended to Tikkun Chatzos to ensure that the sadness of the service would yield its profit and shift the worshiper to a mood of joy amid the awareness that his negative energy field has been shattered. For a joy such as this, which comes after a period of melancholy, is superior. Precisely, listen to this verse from Solomon. He says like this, like the advantage of light over darkness. As the Zohar states on the verse, as I saw that there is an advantage to wisdom over stupidity, like the advantage of light over darkness. Try to figure out that verse from Solomon, and then the elaboration of it, the commentary from Zohar. Let's just read it how the Tanya says it, and then we'll discuss it. The advantage of light over darkness could also be read the advantage of light that comes from darkness. Your joy is more powerful when it is a product of some serious soul searching and the feeling of pain over your mistakes and shortcomings. So just like, when do you really appreciate light? When you're in a pitch dark room, then even the small light of your phone, or even a little light that if you're in an office or at home, usually is not appreciated. But now all of a sudden, when it's pitch dark, you appreciate the small light so much. So there's an advantage of light that comes from darkness. And similar to that, there's an advantage to wisdom over stupidity, because anyone knows wisdom over stupidity that works. So what's the commentary of the Zohar? And we'll just read it over here now, just to understand a little bit. Look up the citation to the Zohar, but this should already be enough to the wise. So the Zohar states, listen to this beautiful explanation. The advantage of light comes only through darkness. What establishes white? Black. For were it not for black, white would not be recognized. That's such a cool thing. And because of black, white is lifted up and made precious. Because we have black, and then white comes out, you have white as a color, you appreciate the white over black. So Rabbi Yitzchak said, this is a quote in the Zohar, an analogy would be sweet and bitter. For a person does not recognize sweetness until he tastes bitter. What causes it to be sweet? The bitterness. When you have bitterness, then it makes something sweet. You have something else that's sweet. But you need that bitterness first. You need the black to have the white. And then the white is superior to the black. And scripture is explicit about this fundamental importance of eliminating sadness. So this is a famous teaching from the Arizal. And if there's one thing that you're going to walk out today from today's Tanya class, it's going to be this central teaching of the Arizal, of Rabbi Isaac Luria. He died in Tzfat in 1572. Amazing that he died at the young age of 37. And it just teaches you how much a person could accomplish, even in a short life. Actually, this week, we also describe in this week's parasha, this week's Torah portion, the death of Rachel, the matriarch, who also died at 37. And yet, Rachel forever is, my wife is actually named after her, right? Adina's middle name is Rachel. So you just see how amazing the original matriarch was, and the legacy that she carries through all generations, and even in a short period of time. But listen to this verse that the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, explains. And scripture is explicit about this fundamental importance of eliminating sadness. Here's a verse from the Torah. The verse says like this: because you did not serve God, your God, with joy and with gladness of heart, from an abundance of everything. In Hebrew, the words are merav kol. Therefore, you will serve your enemies, whom God will send against you amid hunger, thirst, nakedness, and total destitution. So this is a quote from Parashat Ki Tavo in the book of Deuteronomy. Moshe's parting words to the Jews in the desert before he dies. He tells them, you better shape up, because if you don't carry this way, it's going to be, the going is going to get tough. So the verse that we're elaborate, the main words of the verse, I'll just say it in Hebrew and then translate it again, is Tachat asher lo avadata et Hashem elokecha b'simcha, which means since you do not serve God with joy and with gladness of heart. And Arizal's commentary on this verse is well known. The literal meaning of merov kol is the mem in merov kol would mean from an abundance of everything. It is because you didn't serve God with joy when you had an abundance of everything, therefore the negative consequences came. That's the simple meaning. From an abundance of everything. Meaning because you had an abundance of everything. In the desert, right, we had food falling from the heavens. It could have tasted like almost anything. We had Moshe as the teacher. We had the clouds of glory laundering our clothing for us. We had no worries. God protected us. We had everything. And still, you didn't serve God with joy. But Arizal, this great Kabbalist, he reads Merov Kol as more than an abundance of everything. Merov Kol means not only from an abundance, Merov could also mean more than an abundance. What does that mean? According to this translation, the verse states, it was because you didn't experience more joy in your worship of God than you did in the abundance of everything else. I'm just going to keep it on this page for a moment. I'm just going to grab a cup of water, clear my throat. I'll be right back. And here we go. Just to use the opportunity, we'll make a blessing. If anyone has a cup of juice, water, soda, coffee in front of them, I have water here today, and we make a blessing like this. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol niyah bidvaro. L'chaim. So let's try to figure out this beautiful teaching of the Arizal. He's learning the Hebrew words merov kol, not simply the way we translate it in the verse of the Torah, which is that we didn't serve God when we had an abundance of everything, from an abundance of everything. He's learning it as more than an abundance of everything. And then the way we read the verse is, you didn't experience more joy in your worship of God than you did in the abundance of everything. Meaning that we had more joy when we were involved in everything than we did when we served God. Our joy didn't come from the service of God. It actually came from our everything else, I think. Let's read that further. I'm just going to turn the page now. That negative consequences followed. So I wish he was going to explain that a little more, because this is a very famous, I think the way we just described it is, and Arizal's commentary on this verse is well known. So when he says well known, it seems like it's something we should really hammer in. The way that Arizal is understanding the verse is not simply that we didn't serve God when we had everything, which is a simple meaning. He's learning that the reason why the consequences came is because our joy was more involved in other things and not in our worship, not in our service. Meaning that's not what really brought us joy. And what we're trying to hammer in over here is the crucial component of joy in our service. That, like we're saying before with the wrestler, that if one of the wrestlers, even if he's better trained and stronger and more experienced, and yet if he's sluggish and lazy that day, and he woke up on the wrong side of his bed, he's not going to be able to be victorious in his battle. and the weaker person will be able to overcome him. So we're saying that in our service of God, to do it properly, it requires joy. And without joy, meaning if we serve God, but we just serve God because that's what we have to do, but it's not our meaning, our joy, then consequences follow, not really as a punishment, but it's just because we're lacking in what we're doing, and then things get out of hand. So if there's a Yiddish expression, some of you have heard this, perhaps even from your great-grandparents, one way or another. When Jews would come here from the old country, they would say, "Es ist schwer zu sein a Yid," which means it's hard, it's tough to be a Jew. You're living in the land of the free, where there's so much opportunity and wealth, and Shabbos becomes more of a thing that we try to keep on the side, and all the holidays. So a lot of Jews would complain it's hard to be a Jew in this world, or even in the shtetl. It was also hard with all the pogroms and stuff. But the proper way, our proper expression should be, "Es ist gut zu sein a Yid." It's good to be a Jew. And really, our joy should be in our observance. And that's really where we should be finding the meaning. And finding in our service, I think that's how we're learning the Arizal. If anyone has another, let me see if there's any tidbit over here. Nope. Okay. Okay. So this, back to Barbara. Well, let's see how this elaborates. This is probably the main section over here. And let's see how it talks about our discussion from earlier this morning. Section 3, how to cope with suffering. So now the Tanya will teach us a powerful tool to eliminate the negative emotions of sadness and worry. This tool is for sadness and worry about general life problems, such as issues of health and finance. In section 4, we will deal with sadness prompted by religious matters. So here we're talking about life issues that come up. In general, it's going to be broken into 3 main issues. Bane, in Hebrew or in Aramaic, actually, the expression is Bane, Chaye, Umizoni, which is the struggles of child rearing and children, whether having children or not having children, but the struggles that comes along. The struggles of health, and that's a very broad category, from physical health struggles, both of ourselves and of our loved ones and our close friends. That's a struggle for all of us. It's a crisis. Or mental health struggles, emotional health struggles, spiritual health struggles. And then livelihood, money, which is also a huge stress and a strain on many. So that's the sadness that comes as a result of these categories, is what we're going to be working on now, how to cope with it. And then in section 4, we're going to talk about struggles and sadness that comes from religious matters, from our observance. So now the following is a prescribed plan, which is actually a quote from the prophet Isaiah, to free yourself from any sadness or hint of worry about material things, even in the highly emotive areas, and like I just quoted in the Aramaic, of children, health, and livelihood. I'm sorry, I think I quoted that from the Zohar. He quotes it here from the Talmud, from Moed Katan, which is the 3 categories that that we all care about tremendously, and that's Bane, Chaye, Umizoni, which is children, health, and livelihood. So let's see how to cope with struggles that come up and sadness that results from these categories. Everyone knows the teaching of our sages of blessed memory. This is a really tough statement. A person is obligated to bless God for misfortune in the same way that he blesses God for the good. That's a quote from the Mishnah, from Tractate Brachot, the opening tractate, the opening Masechta of the Talmud, that says, Kashem, I'll say it in Hebrew, Kashem shemavarach ala tova, kach mevarchen ala ra. Just like you have to bless God for the good, you also have to bless God on the not so good. And we see that clearly, like I mentioned before, at a funeral or at any other times. You bless God. That are a time, if God forbid, if there's a fire, we also bless God. Baruch Dayan Ha'emet. We say that blessing. Blessed is God who's the true judge. And many times I speak to some of you, And your answer, even when there's health struggles in your families, your answer is Baruch Hashem, thank God. Doesn't mean it's good, but we thank God. What we're going to be saying here is that it's a higher type of good, which seems like a very heavy expression. And just to preface, there was a teacher that, a Chabad teacher, that going back to the shtetl, and he would study Talmud, and he would describe this statement from the Talmud, and they would analyze it like they do in the yeshivas, that you have to bless God for the bad as much as you bless God for the good. And this teacher, his livelihood, he didn't make much money from his students and as a teacher. He had a cow, and that's where he derived his parnasa. His livelihood came from his cow, from the milking of the cow, and from selling the milk. And one day he was teaching, and some of his students come to him in middle with some bad news. The bad news was that his cow, source of his livelihood, died, which means now he's going to be depleted. He didn't know that yet, and they came to tell him the news. And they tell him, Rebbe, is it true what you tell us, that you have to bless God on the bad as much as you bless God on the good? And he says, of course, we analyzed it, we discussed it, we had a whole pool on it. We had a whole debate and a whole deep thesis on it. So they said, okay, so then we have some good news for you. Your cow died. And he was speechless. He couldn't fathom what tomorrow is going to be. And they say, Rebbe, you told us that it's a clear Talmud that we have to follow. And he says, I guess I never understood the Talmud, because it made so much sense speaking it, but now when it actually came to him, it was a whole different beast to try to absorb and internalize. So I'm not saying it's easy, but the Tanya section 3 over here from chapter 26 is so integral to life, because we all face these challenges. Someone who doesn't have any of these challenges, I would love to meet them, but we all struggle with these categories. It's the way Hashem made us. And I'm not saying we have to. Of course, lucky is the person, Ashrei, lucky is the person that is able to see success in all these matters. And the order is an important order, right? Livelihood should be the least of our worries. Of course, it is a worry, especially with the crisis and the pandemic and the financial well-being of the world. But more important is our children and our health. And then the last of the needs would be livelihood. Right? Because I think, what's the expression? Is there an expression, or there should be an expression, that anything that could be solved with money is not such a problem? Meaning, even if I don't have the money now, if it's solvable and all it takes is more money, not that you have the money, but it's not the biggest problem. Health, children, that's something that it takes more than just money to solve. Anyway, that's more of another discussion. But listen to this, what the Tanya says on this now. And according to the Talmud, this means, this is straight Talmud so far, you should accept misfortune joyously, with the same joy you would have for good, which is open and manifest. So just like, this is a quote from the Talmud, just like when there's good that's manifested and open, you have joy, you made money, you feel joyous, you have health, you feel appreciative, and you thank God for it. So the same way you have the good that you see that's open, you should also be thanking God and be joyous on what we don't see. The Tanya takes for granted here that the reader believes in Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, that everything is orchestrated by God, so it must be good. That's a very heavy discussion. And over here, the Tanya, I think even when we started this class last year, November 2019, one of the prefaces I gave is that Tanya is already telling you, based on the premise that you believe in God, because that's a whole different discussion, the belief in God. But Tanya is already saying, okay, we have a God, God gave us souls, we have a Torah, we know the Torah is God-given, then we have that base. So over here, chapter 26 has a base that is already granted, given, that is Hashgacha Pratis, that everything is divinely orchestrated. And therefore, if everything is divinely orchestrated, nothing from heaven is going to be bad. we may not see the good. So then it's goodness that is concealed. It's not yet revealed. It's not yet manifest. Just to pause for a moment, some of our favorite stories from the Talmud, I've probably shared them with you before. Every now and then they come back to me, is the famous story of Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, this is after the temple was destroyed, and things were really tough in Israel with the Romans, and there was curfew set. It's actually, I wouldn't compare it to the curfews put into most of the counties in California now, but there was curfews, and there was gates to the cities. And after a certain hour, by nightfall, the gates were closed, and that means you can't get into the city. So Rabbi Akiva was traveling, and he knocks on the gates of a city to enter, and they say, it's curfew already, you're not allowed in. And he didn't pull the rabbi card, I'm Rabbi Akiva, please let me in. He says, I need safety. And they said, no, you came after curfew. This is in Israel. So he was forced to sleep in the cold and dark of the forest, vulnerable to the elements, and also to the war and the Romans that were around. And he stayed outside of the gates in the forest, and all he had with him was a candle to learn with, a donkey, to put his possessions on, and a rooster to wake him up in the morning. That's what his possessions were. And as he's studying outside of the city, a wind comes and blows out his candle, extinguishes his candle. And he says, the words that Rabbi Akiva uses is, Kol man davar rachmana l'tav avid. Whatever God does, he does it for the good. Did I share the story recently? Is this familiar? No? Okay. Whatever he does for the good. And then he doesn't have a candle, so he can't really study anymore. So he tries to go into sleep. And a fox comes and attacks the rooster. And he has no more rooster. And he says, whatever God does, he does for the good. And then some other bigger animal comes and attacks his donkey. And now he's left with nothing. And he says, Kol man davar rachmana l'tav avid. God, whatever you do for the good. Pretty powerful expression of faith right there. And he goes to sleep, and in the middle of the night, he's awakened by the sound of soldiers attacking the city. They come, they break through the gates of the city with their big beams or whatever, however, I don't know what that thing is called. And they attack the city. They kill out a big number. They arrest the women and children, send them away, and they take all the possessions, all the spoil. And now he realizes that if he would have been let in to this city, he would have been a victim. If his candle would have been lit, they would have seen him. If his rooster and his donkey would have they would have made noises. So he really then was able to understand the blessing that he had, that everything was for the good. There's another story that happened with his teacher. Rabbi Akiva, one of his teachers from the generation previously, was a man by the name of Nachum, almost similar to Menachem. So I definitely like this guy. His name was Nachum, but he was known by his nickname. His nickname, let me just stop this sharing for a moment. His nickname was Ish Gamzu, a man that was also Gamzu, that would say Gamzu, because, and I'll explain to you what that means. Whatever happened in his life, this teacher, Rabbi Nachum Ish Gamzu, he would say Gamzu Latova. This also is good. This also is for the good. And one of the famous stories that really gave him this name is there was a time, again, with the Romans, they were in charge of Israel for over a century, and during the time of the destruction and after, so they put rules on the Jews, and there were some terrible decrees on the Jewish people that meant death to many of them. So they wanted to send one of their top to go to the emperor and to plead on behalf of the Jews. Either it was the emperor or the general, I don't remember, but one of the people that had a say, the governor, some person that was in Israel, they wanted him to go to and plead for mercy. So they sent Nachum, And they sent him the Jewish community sent him with a chest filled with gold and silver and jewels and diamonds to appease and to give a gift to the king or to the emperor, to the general. So he's on his way, and he stays overnight in an inn where there were a bunch of drunks and unlawful people. And when he went to sleep at night, they realized that he probably has some wealth, and they stole his chest. They stole the gold and silver, but they didn't want him to realize that they stole it. So what they did is they actually took out the gold and silver and jewels and diamonds, and they filled up the chest with dirt, with earth, so that when he wakes up in the morning, it still feels heavy, and he'll just continue on his way. But Nachum obviously was not a fool. He knew that something was up, and he sees in the morning in his chest the earth. But his answer is Gam Zulatova. This too is for the good. And if this is what God did, there has to be something here that is for the good. And he continues his journey to the governor with this chest filled with earth. And he gets to the palace, and they let him in, and he says, "I have gold and silver. I have a chest as a gift to the governor." And they open it up, and they see it's filled with earth. And they say, "This is a mockery. You Jew, you come and you give me earth." And he says, "Maybe it's a special earth." And there was an advisor there who, according to the Talmud, it says was really Elijah that dressed as an advisor for the day. And he says, this is perhaps the earth that the Jewish patriarch Abraham used in his war. Because we know in Parashat Lech Lecha, Abraham and Elazar, his servant, went out to war against the mighty kings of the land. And how did he fight? It says he took earth and sand, and he was throwing it at the enemies. And God made each one of these grains of earth and dirt and sand to turn into arrows. And he was able to be victorious. So every one of that sand pieces was an arrow. So the advisor is telling the governor that maybe this is the same sand that Avram used and could help you at war. It's the greatest gift. So they tried it, and it was real. This earth turned into arrows. This is the story in the Talmud. So the governor was so impressed with this gift. He was amazed. He says, what can I do for you? And he said, please annul the decree. And the governor did. So you're able to see the goodness in what happened, that if he would have brought the gold and silver, the governor perhaps would not be impressed with it. But he was able to bring something that was swapped that made all the difference. That's the story of Nachum Ish Gamzu. So I don't know, we're not studying Talmud now, we're here to study Tanya. But the point of what I was trying to say is to realize in everything the goodness that really results. That perhaps you may not see it, but there has to be good. How do we know it's good? Because it's coming from God. So when the Talmud says that you have to bless God on the bad as much as you do on the good, it's because really anything that's coming from heaven is really good. But there's two layers of good. There's the good that you can see, and there's good that you can't see. It's a higher level of good. So that's what we're going to be discussing now, is coping, the mechanism of coping with struggles in life, to see where it really comes from and to appreciate it for its true source of where it comes from. Not saying it's easy, but let's see how it's done. And then let's see if we could internalize it. So, thank you, Maddie. Yes, it's a lot of, okay. Oh, great, Maddie. Sometimes I think I actually just shared this at Hebrew school. So this story, I like sharing the story, and I actually had some parents of Hebrew school saying, "Could you tell me the full story? Because the kids, I want to make sure I heard it right." So I don't know how many times I've been sharing it, but I guess I'm living with the story now. So I'm glad I was able to share it.
You know what this teaching makes me think of, if anybody remembers what an LP is, a record played on a record player. When you're sitting on the top of the needle, you don't see anything but what's being played at the moment.
Beautiful. That's very nice. That's a great example. Thank you, Robin. I like that.
You're welcome.
Beautiful. And you kind of have to trust that it's playing a beautiful sound, right? If you're like, I don't understand how this works, and you're not even going to try it, that's really nice. I like that.
Right. You're hearing one note, or you're hearing one phrase. You're not hearing the whole symphony.
Beautiful. Okay, so let's see. Oh, and it's actually going to quote the verse, the expression I just said of Gam Zu Latova. So let's see this back inside. I'm just going to share the screen again. We're turning the page in the Kindle, but it's, I think, towards the bottom of 300. While everything is good at some level, we do not always perceive it. The good may be either open and manifest, something which we can appreciate as good in the here and now, or a good which to mortal eyes remains hidden. So that's amazing. There's two types of good. So the Talmud suggests that we should joyously accept an occurrence that we can't perceive as open and manifest good, which is like misfortune, as if we had seen the value in it. Since God allowed it to happen, it must be for the good. So what the Talmud is saying, to accept it joyously, misfortune, because accept it for what it truly is, as if we have seen the value in it, meaning just like we could see the value in good that we could see with our eyes, that's open, we should also accept the misfortune for with joy, for as if we could see the value, what it truly is. The reason being because even this apparently bad occurrence is for the good too. Gam Zu Latova, that's the Hebrew words over here, is for the good too. I think actually in my in-laws, when I go to San Diego, they have like my mother-in-law is great at art, and I think she probably made this on a board. The words "this too is for the good," and it's a great entry point. You know, when a person is coming stressed, to realize, take a moment to meditate that there's good in everything. And if you could just tap into, not necessarily see it now, but trust that there is the good in it and be joyous in that good, that's actually an incredible thing. Really incredible. Not saying easy, but it's a powerful tool to try to meditate on. Let's see. This too is for the good too, though this fact is not clear or discernible with our mortal eyes. The above represents normative rabbinic theology. Oh, so that's the rabbinic part. That's just Talmud. Now the Tanya adds an additional insight based on the Kabbalah. So welcome to the world of Kabbalah and Chassidus and Tanya, where till now we were just analyzing a Talmud for what it means, meaning you bless God for the misfortune, just like you bless God on the good, because in truth there's good in that misfortune too, because it's coming from God and nothing bad comes from the heaven. But now let's understand it with the Kabbalistic lens, because this apparent misfortune stems from the unmanifest world. I never heard of that word. Unmanifest means the non-manifested world, I think. I like that. Which is above the manifest world. So the higher unmanifest world, which is a quote from the Zohar. So just the Aramaic words of the Zohar here, for those who would appreciate it, is the word in Hebrew for world is an olam. In Aramaic, the word is alma. Similar. Alma or olam. It's the same root. And covered in Hebrew means kisoi. And in Aramaic, it's iskasia. So the word over here is the unmanifest world is alma de iskasia. Contains a greater good, but one which cannot be appreciated by us here in the manifest world. You ought to accept seemingly unfortunate occurrences joyously, amid the awareness that paradoxically, they are an expression of a higher source, which was unable to express itself in this world as something positive. Wow. So you should accept unfortunate events with joy, that they are a higher source, that because of their higher source, they can't come out and manifest themselves in this world. They can't come out in a positive way, the way we can appreciate it. That's a world that's unmanifest. That's the English word. In Hebrew, it's called Alma de Iskasia. And there's Alma de Iskalia. That's the manifest world, from the word Giloi. So I'm just going to take one more moment and pause here. So just to make sure we're in sync over here, what we're trying to get to is there's good and there's even higher good. The higher good is just too good for it to be manifest in the world. For something to be manifest in the world, it has to come down, down, until we could appreciate it. But then there's a level that is too beyond being appreciated by us in our mortal eyes, in our regular way. It's a higher good. What we see as misfortune, in truth, is coming from a higher source. So it is a misfortune. It is sad. But if we could tap in and see that I may not see it with my eyes, the positive, but I know that it's coming from God. And the reason why I see it as a misfortune is because it's coming from a higher source of good. That could bring you to a place of joy. Not easy. And we have a lot more to study in this chapter to understand it more. But that's a general idea. And I hope you don't tune out now and say that's too beyond me trying to understand, because this is the long haul. Tanya is a journey, and it doesn't all make sense right now. And I agree, and I'm with you. But we need to hold hands and get through this, because if we could, I think it's the greatest secret in life, that when we see misfortune, how to bless God on it and do it joyously is coming from here. So what we're about to get into is God has 7 names, 7 holy names. They're known as the 7 names that cannot be erased, which means that we can't erase the name Elohim, the name Kale, which I don't even pronounce. If you realize, it's really an aleph at the beginning, and I'm saying it with a kuf, with a K sound, because not during prayer I actually don't say God's name. But the holiest name of God is made up of 4 letters, a Yud, Hey, a Vav, and another Hey. We actually don't pronounce that. When we see the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, those 4 letters, which spells God's name, we actually pronounce it as Ado, like in Baruch Atah, Ado, but it's actually spelled Yud, Hey, Vav, and Hey. Only in the times of the temple, by the Kohen Gadol, the high official, would he be able to pronounce the name. But we don't do it. Like we say, Bayom Ahu, Yeh Hashem Echad U'Shmo Echad. On that day, when Mashiach comes, God and His name will be one, meaning we'll pronounce God's name as it really should be pronounced. But until then, we don't, because the holiness is too intense, and we're not worthy to be able to pronounce that name. But in that name, the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, it's comprised of 4 letters. So if you break it up in half, the first 2 letters is a Yud and a Hey. The next 2 letters is a Vav and a Hey. In terms of spiritual worlds, each one of these letters is manifesting a light of God. The Yud, which is literally in the Torah, the Yud is just a dot. It's the smallest letter. That's the initial seed of God's light into the world, which is too beyond us grasping and appreciating. It's the light of God that's almost at the infinite capacity, meaning God's light is infinite. And the first stage of where God's infinite light is coming into a finite way, all there is really that seed, a dot. From there, it gets analyzed and gets manifest more through the worlds and the chain of God's light emanating to the world. It comes into a Hey. A Hey is a very broad, wide letter. And then it comes down into the Vav. The Vav is a line from up to down. And that's a letter of God's name that's bringing the light of God to the lower worlds. It's the flow, like the line. A Vav is a flow, a line that flows God's light into the lower worlds. And then once it comes into the lower world, it comes with another Hey, which again, it manifests itself into the lower world. That's actually what we can appreciate, that last Hey of God. Which, by the way, we analyzed this in chapter 8 when we discussed a little bit about teshuvah. Teshuvah, if you take the word teshuvah, it means to return. The last letter is a Hey of teshuvah, of the word teshuvah. If you take the word teshuvah, you break it, it could be tashuv Hey, which means it could be, our job is to return the letter Hey back into God's name. Because what happens in life is God's last letter of Hey, which is manifest into the world, could get lost in world with sins and mistakes and different struggles that we have, that we kind of lose ourselves. Our job in Teshuvah is to bring the Hey back into God's name, to bring it back to its source. That's Teshuvah, Tashuv Hey, to bring back the letter Hey into God's name. But back to the point here. So you have a yud, a hey, a vav, and a hey. What we're saying here is the yud hey of God's name is the way God's light is manifest in the higher worlds, in the hidden worlds, in the way the word over here that we're using is in the unmanifest world. Alma Diskasia. That's the yud and the hey of God's name. It's the higher letters, which is the way God's light is before it manifests itself. And then you have the vav hey, which is the manifest world, the way God's light is coming in a way we could appreciate. Now that we understand that, what we're trying to say is that there's a level of good that we could appreciate. That's coming from the last two letters of God's name, the vav and the hey, the manifest world. But then there's a level of good, of God's light, that is from the unmanifest world, from Alma Diskasia, which is a level of good that is too beyond us appreciating in a manifest way. And our work has to be to try to see the joy in what's not able to manifest itself as good, to see the good that really is in it. And to trust the good and therefore be joyous in it. Let's just see that inside. What I was trying to get to is a verse. So we'll read for another minute or two, and just to see how that connects to a verse that's in by King David. Let me just share the screen again, and we'll wrap up with the next few lines. We're on the bottom paragraph of the Kindle, and I think the top of 301. The manifest world is represented by the last two letters of the Tetragrammaton, which Tetragrammaton is God's holy name, the Vav and the Hey. And the unmanifest world is represented by the first two letters of the Tetragrammaton, which is Yud Hey. And I guess he's going to explain it now. Let's see how he explains it. The four letters of God's name, the Tetragrammaton, the Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey, are subdivided by Kabbalists into two groups, indicating that God can be experienced in two ways. The last two letters, which is the Vav and the Hey, refer to God as He is experienced in the manifest world. The Vav, which is the vertical line, symbolizes the journey downwards from unmanifest to manifest. And the Hey, which extends fully in both vertical and horizontal directions, represents the diverse polarization of the manifest world. But the first two letters, which is the Yud and the Hey, refer to God as He is unmanifest. This is expressed by the formless Yud, which typographically is just a dot, devoid of any polarity. So the Vav and the Hey, the last two letters of God's name, is the flow, the vertical line is symbolizing the journey of God's divine energy into the world, and then how it gets manifest with the Hey in horizontal and vertical lines of the Hey, which is showing the diversity, the polarization in the world. But the Yud and the Hey, the first two letters of God's name, is above the manifest in world. It's just the dot of the Yud. It's the higher unmanifest world. And just to wrap up with this beautiful verse, and this is the meaning of the verse. Listen to this verse. Fortunate is the man whom you, O God, admonish. That's from Psalms. The word in Hebrew, it's actually quite important here to I'm going to circle the letters in Hebrew. Even if you don't read or speak Hebrew, I'm just going to, I don't know if you can see my red dot, but the verse says like this: Ashrei hagever, blessed is the man, or fortunate is the person, Asher tiasrenu, Yud and Hey, that God admonishes. So in English, you just pronounce Yud Hey as God. But which name of God are we referring to? Specifically, only the first two letters of God's Tetragrammaton, the Yud and the Hey. So lucky is the person that God admonishes, but what admonishment is coming from the level of God, from Yud and the Hey, which is the unmanifest light of God in the world that is beyond manifestation in the world. Like we said before, the Yud and the Hey are the two letters of God's name that is in the concealed world. So when it says in this verse that fortunate is the person that God admonishes, what level are we referring to? Where is the admonishment coming from? Yud and the Hey. From the level of God, God's name, that is beyond manifestation. Because otherwise, this verse is an insult. Lucky is a person that God is admonishing. Admonishment never seemed like a good thing. But over here, we're saying, wait a minute, the admonishment is coming from Yud and the Hey, which means this person is lucky to have a level of good that is coming from this hidden, concealed world of the Yud and the Hey. This is Chassidus 101, taking a verse of the Torah, over here from Psalms, and analyzing the letters that it uses to pronounce God, which over here is only the Yud and the Hey, because there's 7 names of God. Over here, it chooses only to refer to God as the Yud and the Hey. Why? Because over here, we're talking about a level of God's light that is beyond manifestation. And in that level of beyond manifestation, that's why you're lucky. It's an amazing thing. And we have a lot to discuss. We're already over time. I apologize. We started around 2 minutes late today, but it's not done. We need you to come back next week. What I want you to try to meditate on, and I'm actually going to call my mentor to discuss, is take tragedy that you don't see the good, take crisis and pandemics. Are you supposed to thank God for it? I think the answer is yes. It's coming from a level of God that we can't see. How do we relate to that? I don't know yet. And I want you to meditate on that. I'm going to work on it as well. But over here in this section, we're not done yet. But what we are discussing is how to cope with struggles we have with our children, with health, with livelihood, and how, when things are tough, to realize how lucky we are and to realize the good in it and to be joyous in the struggle. Because in truth, that means God is gifting us from a level that's even beyond manifestation. There's a level that is manifest, which is the revealed world, the manifest world. And there's a level of God's light and God's love that is from the unmanifest world. Alma discassia. If we're having these struggles which cause us to be sad, you should realize that where it's coming from. It's coming from God's innermost light. And when we have it from there, it should bring out a sense of joy. How, what, make it happen, we'll have to find out next week. But I'm looking forward to more classes together. Lots to study, but this is a beautiful chapter, and thank you all for joining. Oh, Adrian, I'm so absolutely beautiful lesson. Thank you. I'm so happy. Awesome.
Thank you, Rabbi.
All right, we've got
Thank
a lot
you
to
so
study,
much.
and we could only do it together. So thank you for all your input, and tell me what you think of next week, because I'll definitely love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. Thank you.
This has been absolutely magical. Thank you so
It
much.
is.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Chapter 26 is everything you've been promising us.
Awesome. Great. Great. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you next week. Stay healthy.
Bye, you too.